Morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening on our weekly AJA series. Tonight, we welcome everybody who's with us. I can see we have a wonderful crowd here online, live on our Zoom, to those who are watching on our Facebook Live, or if you're listening in on Jaya tomorrow or watching the recording. Often it seems like the authorities are not interested in protecting the Jewish community. Sometimes individuals use the law to defend their rights as Jews. Tonight we welcome our guest, Menachem Vorchheimer. He is an active Jewish human rights advocate. Menachem has a proven track record of taking on antisemites and winning. Thank you very much for joining us, and please welcome Menachem.
Thank you, Tanel, and good evening to everyone, and also a special shout out, if I may, to my father-in-law, who I believe is with us in the audience tonight, so thank you. I'm going to pull up a presentation, and we're going to talk through this presentation together. So just give me a moment to put up the share screen, if I may.
Yep, it's working perfectly.
Thank you. So tonight's presentation is very Victorian law-centric. However, the references to the Crimes Act and Summary Offences Act, there are mirror provisions in New South Wales and Queensland, and in fact, all states and territories within Australia. References to the civil provisions of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act can be used for matters occurring in and outside of the state of Victoria. There's also federal laws such as Section 18C of the Race Discrimination Act 1975 available. And they're just some of the provisions that we'll talk about tonight. I'm sure that I'm not alone in feeling let down by our government and our authorities in failing to prosecute many of the incidents of anti-Semitism we've seen over the last, well, I guess it's over, what are we getting, 13 and a half months. And at the present point in time, Jews are facing two wars. The first one is a physical war in which we are fighting for our survival and our existence. The second war that we're facing is a war of narratives. It is the words that are used about Jews to try and demonize us, to make it possible for those that wish to annihilate us able to prosecute that war. If I just take you back a little bit, in April 1933, that's when the first boycotts of Jewish shops and businesses occurred. A little bit later, 2 years later, in May of 1935, Jews were barred from serving in the German army. Now, some of you may or may not be aware, and my family included, were very patriotic and committed to Germany. They saw themselves often as Germans first and Jewish second. Many of them had their sons and or loved ones, spouses, serve in the German army in World War I, and some did not come home. So to be barred from the army was, besides being an act of discrimination towards the Jewish population, was seen as highly offensive to the Jewish population, who identified very keenly as members of German society. September 1935, the Nuremberg laws, the race laws, were passed, where Jews were no longer considered German citizens. March 1936, Jewish doctors were barred from practicing medicine in German institutions. In October 1938, following a request from the Swiss authorities, Jewish passports were marked with the letter J. September of 1941, Jews were forced to wear yellow stars. In October 1941, Auschwitz was established. Just quickly by a show of hands, if I may, who in the audience feels frustrated by the surge in anti-Semitism? So there should be a little emoji you can put down. Is it fair to say the vast majority of us do? Who is upset, if I may ask, that police haven't charged those who've incited hatred against our community, dressed up as Hamas terrorists on the streets of Melbourne, or burnt the Israeli flag, whether it be Melbourne or in Sydney, or indeed out of the Opera House? Are people upset about that? Okay. Who's been led to believe that our police are powerless to act? Is that the narrative that the government's been pushing, that the police are not able to act? Fair premise? What would you do if I were to tell you that that is actually not true? I'm going to pull up something for you, if I may. On the 7th of November, this is an article from the 7th of November, Victoria Police put out a press release in relation to an operation in which they arrested and charged several men. The men were charged or to be charged on serious racial vilification offences and also with grossly offensive public conduct. Just relate to. And I want you to look at first the top line. The first line said that the conduct in question transpired between the 22nd of October 2024, i.e. less than a month ago, and the 31st of October 2024. The conduct for which they were arrested and brought in for questioning and which they're going to be charged for related to the following, including burning of a Chinese flag outside the Chinese embassy, targeting pro-refugee protesters in Melbourne Docklands, dressing up as members of Ku Klux Klan, harassing a police officer online following police intervention at this pro-refugee rally. The arrests were made approximately 2 weeks. I emphasize 2 weeks after the alleged conduct. I emphasize that because we're talking over years and some of the incidents we've seen have happened, and there's been no action. And what are the charges that police are looking at? The first one is grossly offensive public conduct. It's under section 195K, and it's got quite a hefty penalty. I think it's up to 5 years in jail. Second is serious racial vilification under section 24 of the racial religious laws. And the reason I bring that up, and I want you to just look back in paragraph 2 there, and let's change 2A from Chinese flag to Israeli flag. Let's go to B, and let's take out targeting pro-refugee protesters. Let's change that from targeting pro-refugee protesters to targeting pro-Israel protesters. Let's go to C, and let's change that from dressing up as members of Ku Klux Klan to dressing up as members of Hamas terrorists. And let's go to paragraph 2D and change that from harassing a police officer online to harassing a member of the Jewish community or a Jewish leader online. And the reason I say that is all those things I've just talked about have happened over the last 12 months. But we haven't seen large numbers of arrests. I don't think for many of that stuff was. And the reason I articulate that is because what this shows and the ability of police to act so quickly and so forcefully against the neo-Nazis shows that the law exists. But I want to tell you something else you may or may not know. Who are the individuals in these circumstances that were targeted? Do people know? Do people know who was targeted? So the pro-refugee rally was organized by people from the socialist. Ring a bell? The socialist left are often the same individuals who attend the anti-Israel protests. The socialist left faction of the Australian Labor Party controls the Victorian government. Jacinta Allen is a member of the socialist left. Anthony Albanese is a member of the socialist left. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the laws exist, and I think it's very clear the laws exist. And I think sometimes perhaps that the law, rather than being applied equally, is applied on a political basis. And I think a lot of us feel as if, particularly what we've seen recently, the motion with which Penny Wong supported at the United Nations was out of line with past governments. And it's been argued that one of the reasons that Penny Wong broke ranks with Australia's traditional support is because they want to win favour with certain voters. And I think at the end of the day that governments need to act on what's morally right and what's morally wrong, what the law is. The law needs to be applied equally, not along political lines. And so therefore, when I saw that news on the 7th of November, the actions against the neo-Nazis, it concerned me deeply because it articulated and made clear to me that we have the laws, that police can act, and they can act quickly when they want to. They can act forcefully. But the choice not to act appears in my mind to be largely political. So I'm going to just give you an idea of the presentation I'm going to run through tonight. I'm first going to talk to you about the legal framework of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act in Victoria. I'm then going to work through the Ocean Grove football case, which is the original case that I ran against the state of Victoria Police in 2006 to 2008. I'm going to talk about the case of Blair Cottrell, a neo-Nazi who was convicted under the Racial Religious Tolerance Act and then appealed that judgment to the county court. And I'm going to go through what that appeal judgment talks about and where that fits into the freedom of speech and political debate and vilification. And then I'm going to run through some of my current legal actions and the outcomes that I'm seeking. So very quickly, I'm not going to be legislative heavily. The legal framework is as follows. The Racial Religious Tolerance Act has both civil provisions and criminal provisions. The civil provisions make it possible to take action against an individual on the basis that they engage in conduct that incites hatred against or contempt or revulsion or ridicule of a person on the basis of their race or religion. In the civil provisions, there are also two other very important clauses that are worth noting. Section 15, which is a prohibition about authorizing and assisting vilification and victimization. So, for example, if you're a rally organizer and you know of certain people being there and engaging in contact and you have the ability to do something about it. So it may not be feasible when you have a large rally, but you've got a smaller rally and you know about problems and you don't know anything about it. It could be seen as you're authorized or assisted. So you have to be aware of the conduct and you have to have the capacity to intervene. If you are aware and you don't intervene, you could be liable. The second one is vicarious liability, and that's the premise generally out loud that an employer is liable for the actions of employees or their agents. They're the civil provisions. On the criminal side, they're very similar to the civil provisions, but the exception is that in the civil provision, what you must show is that the conduct incited hatred for a person on the basis of their race or religion. Whereas in the criminal provisions, you must show that the provocateur, the individual, intended to incite that hatred. So there are two elements. So in civil, you just must show that the incitement transpired, whereas in criminal, you must show that the person intended that the incitement would occur. So some of you may or may not know that in general terms, very shortly running through, that in 2006, on Simchat Torah, I was walking to shul with my two young children, then aged 3 and 6, and driving through or down Balaclava Road, which for those in Melbourne would know, and those which are not in Melbourne, is like this main arterial to the Jewish community, was a busload of footballers coming back from an inter-season trip. And as they drove down Balaclava Road, they were shouting out various epithets towards members of the Jewish community. As they came past myself, someone called out "Hail Hitler," another one motioned as if he was shooting a machine gun, mowing down myself and my children. They weren't necessarily the brightest lot because the lights right in front of them had just turned red. So on Hotham Street, Balaclava, on Hotham Street, you've got the Yeshiva Shul, you've got the Sephardi Shul, you've got Heichel Torah. These are two big areas lots of Jews are. I went over to the driver of the bus and I brought to his attention the concerns about the conduct of the people behind. He didn't want to know about it. I asked him where they're from and whether he could do anything he wanted to know. As did the light turned green, and as the bus drove off, someone leaned out, grabbed my yarmulke hat and drove off. Car behind this bus saw that, overtook the bus on the wrong side of the road, cut it off. So probably about 40 or 50 meters away from me, I then ran down to try and grab back my hat, my yarmulke. I was grabbed, forcibly grabbed and held and punched across the face and struck under the eye and getting a cut. Bus then decided to try and leave. I ended up sitting down in front of that bus covered in. Several police cars arrived. When I was speaking to the police officers, the driver of the bus overheard the conversation in which I said to one of the police officers, the person that struck me was wearing a pink. The driver of the bus got onto the bus, said something to the group, and everyone took their tires off. Fast forward, 3 months later, nobody had been charged, and I was becoming incredibly frustrated. I also subsequently became aware that the driver of that bus was an off-duty member of Victoria Police. Now, if you remember before we talked about this premise of vicarious liability, now there's something really unique about members of Victoria Police, because at 5 o'clock when they finish their shift, they are technically still bound by the Police Regulations Act. Police Regulations Act, which we discovered, said that an off-duty member of Victoria Police has still got certain duties to his employer. So on that basis, a legal argument we put together was vicarious liability applied, and therefore on the basis of his knowledge and the like, the prohibition of authorising the system could kick in, and therefore we could sue the state of Victoria and Victoria Police. Now this was a little bit of a novel thing. We weren't sure whether it would stack up. I spoke to Remy Vanderweel, Robert Richter, and Norman Rosenbaum. And they suggested I draft it up and put it together. And we went and sought advice from a guy called Dyson Hall ACKC. And Dyson went through it and he said he loves it. He thought it was an awesome idea. He says, what I want you to do is the following. I want you to file it, and once you've got confirmation of it, I then want you to make 2 copies. I want you to take the first copy and hand deliver it to the Premier. The Premier at the time was Steve Bracks. So I want you to make a second copy, and I want you to hand deliver it to the police minister, who at the time was Bob Cameron. He says, what will happen is, after the Premier's office gets it and the police minister's office gets it, they will call the Chief Commissioner and tell them they need to address it. And that's exactly what happened. I lodged these proceedings in late December 2006. 6th of January 2008, we got a phone call, police come in. They told us that they're going to reopen the investigation, assigning 5 officers to it. And as a result of that, they ended up charging 4 boys, all of whom. I continued on with my civil action, and it was ultimately settled. And if I may, I'm just going to play you a short clip after that.
A Jewish man has won his battle with Victoria Police over racial abuse claims, agreeing to settle out of court. And in an unusual step, Deputy Commissioner Simon Overland was left to publicly apologise on behalf of the force. Alicia Gorey was there.
In a stage-managed affair, Menachem Vorchheimer finally declares he's satisfied with Victoria Police's response.
The parties have worked towards an appropriate outcome. They recognise the important principle of removing racial and religious vilification from our community.
It's 2 years since a group of Ocean Grove footballers on an end-of-season trip to the Caulfield Cup attacked him as he walked with his children. The man at the wheel was an off-duty police officer, Senior Constable Terence Moore. He didn't apologise in person today. Instead, this statement was read on his behalf.
He regrets that he did not immediately confront those persons in an attempt to stop any further act of racial and religious vilification by some of the occupants of the bus.
The Deputy Commissioner was there and said sorry on behalf of the entire force following a Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal hearing.
Victoria Police also acknowledges the concern at the time taken to investigate this matter, and that Mr Vorchheimer and his family have continued to suffer hurt.
None of the men would take questions. Today's statements come after mediation and form just part of the out-of-court settlement. Victoria Police has also agreed to review its training and policies surrounding racism and prejudice.
In this way, some considerable good may come from this disturbing event.
Alicia Gorey, 9 News.
Menachem, can I just pause you for a moment? I've had a number of comments that the sound quality from you is very poor. Do you want to try the headset?
Sure, I'll do that now. So
We'll see if you use the microphone on the headset, whether that
is that any better?
We'll try that and see how we go. So kick on.
Can you hear me now, or?
I can hear you. I can hear you fine. Sounds okay. A bit better.
Is that better for everyone?
You won't get answers from everyone. Just we'll proceed forward from here.
Okay. So as part of that settlement with Victoria Police, and I can't go into the details because of confidentiality, but there was obviously, as mentioned in that news clip, about education and training. There's also an instruction issued by the Chief Commissioner to members of Victoria Police to uphold the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. And I also work with the government and the opposition and even independents at the time for reforms into the Sentencing Act, which allowed for uplift of crimes that were perpetrated on the basis of somebody's attribute. And that was on the basis, in general terms, where an individual was attacked, not because of something they had done, but because they were Jewish or something of that nature. There was the ability for the judge to impose a higher sentence. And one of the cases at the time was a gentleman called Liab Goni. Liab Goni was a Sudanese refugee. And what had happened was 2 gentlemen had a bit too much to drink, and they walked, as they walked out the house, the girlfriend said to him, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" He says, we're going to go find ourselves, and this is the word they said, a nigger to take our anger out on. They went down to a train station. There was a group of Sudanese boys, and they found one, and they chased him down, and they beat him to death with a metal pole. They came back. The pole was saturated with blood and bent out of shape. Liab Goni was the unfortunate victim. And in truth, any one of the boys at that train station could have been that victim. So the amendments to the Sentencing Act were designed around that because the victim was interchangeable. They were looking for somebody of colour to take out their anger on. And it is often the case in relation to prejudice-motivated crimes that the victims are interchangeable. They're not necessarily looking for Menachem. They might be looking for David or Alan or Robert or anybody else. They're not looking for any one of us by name. They're looking for a Jew. And so therefore, when somebody's attacked for the basis of their race or their religion, it's particularly heinous, and because everyone in that class feels very vulnerable. So I lobbied for, and we successfully got a change to legislation that where somebody was attacked on the basis of a variable, and there were 8 classes on the basis of race, on religion, on physical or mental ability. So there was a case of Irvin Plotkin, a man that was mentally disabled, who was attacked because of that. So if somebody attacks someone with that, they could sentence uplift because of their sexual, of their gender, of their sexual orientation and like, there was the ability for sentence uplift. Now, fast forward, that case was settled in 2008, and several years later, there was the case of Blair Cottrell. In short, Blair Cottrell was a leader of a group called the United Patriots Front, a neo-Nazi group. Blair Cottrell was upset about a proposal to build a mosque in the city of Bendigo, and he wanted people to come to the city of Bendigo to protest at a council meeting to stop that transpiring. So he put together a video of a mock beheading as a way to drum up support and get people to come along and be angered about it and come to this meeting. He was charged for that. I'm just going to show you now a news clip, and I'll come back to you shortly if I may.
G'day, I hope this video finds you well. My name is Blair Cottrell.
Takbir! Allah Akbar! Allah Akbar!
We're just going to give you a bit of a taste of our own religious culture. Carry on, brother.
So Blair Cottrell was convicted in 2017. He, along with 2 others, was convicted, and he decided to appeal that to the county court. And he wanted to argue, amongst other things, that the conviction was invalid because under the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and also an implied right under the Constitution, there was a right of freedom of speech and of engaging in political debate. And he argued that his video, in which he encouraged people to come across to this, was part of the process of opposing a mosque. But Justice Kidd, who presided over the matter, and some of you may recall, Justice Kidd also presided over the George Pell trial, disagreed. And this is what he said in short compass. He said, the fact that the appellant, here Blair Cottrell, may have wanted to incite extreme feelings against Muslims for political purpose to attend a rally does not cure the vilification intended. That is, even if his ends were political, here opposing the building of a mosque, the means in which he went about it remained vilifying. Having a political end is not a defense to the charge. And I think most of us would agree that this is really quite something that some of us may or may not know. Some of us hear all the time that the protests that we see in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne are freedom of speech, and that the government is powerless to act because of this implied right for people to say what they want within the context of that. But that's actually not correct. And I'd like to drill that down a little bit further by using an example of some things we've seen in Melbourne and in Sydney. In relation to Blair Cottrell, if he had simply said, I oppose the building of a mosque in the city of Bendigo and encourage people to come without that video and labeling Muslims as terrorists or violent individuals, it probably would have been okay. But once he labeled Muslims as terrorists and as violent individuals, it then vilified a class of individuals and then became problematic. So let's draw the example of what we've seen in the last 12 months. People can oppose Zionism or can oppose the existence of the state of Israel. I think that's fair. We might not like it, but that's fair. But when they then turn around and said that all persons of the Jewish faith are pro-genocide or are terrorists or baby killers or other visceral language, that then moves beyond political debate into the form of vilification. And this is where I think the authorities have got it wrong. Because if they had looked at the law, and I think there's a law starts with a process of legislation, and then that legislation is interpreted by the court through judgment. So we've got court authority, both in the original judgment of the Magistrates Court, upheld on appeal. And by the way, as a point of note, he tried to appeal to the High Court of the point of law, but that was rejected. It was found that the judgment of the county court was solid. So we've got a judgment that makes it very clear about where political speech walks into vilification. So when we're seeing chances all Zionists are terrorists, to me, that is categorically vilification. Now, some might say, well, the premise of Zionism isn't unique to Judaism. So therefore, how can you say that that is religious vilification? Well, if you look at the definitions within the Act, the definition of religious belief is the holding of a lawful or not holding of a lawful religious belief. Religious belief doesn't have to be limited to one group, nor held by all members of that group. It's a religious belief. So therefore, the fact that Christians and Jews believe that Jews have the right to self-determination in the Holy Land is a form of religious discrimination. But let's go one step further. We also know that Israel is predicated on Zionism, on the belief and on scriptures, and the Jews are a race. Some of you may or may not be aware that all Jews, by virtue of their birth, are entitled under the law of return to automatic citizenship in the state of Israel. So that also allows us, and without going into too much detail today, there is case law to say that Jews are also a race. So when we see some of the language that is used at these protests that crosses across from the notion of, you know, what should the borders look like or what should the state of Israel look like, and into vilification and using epithets to describe Jews, we move into the situation of vilification. So I'd like to now tell you, in essence, I've got three forms of action on foot at the moment. And because matters are either before mediation or before the court, I can't go into too much specific detail about them, but I'm going to give you an overview of them. The first of the three actions is against the State of Victoria Police. It is predicated or largely built upon the action in 2006 around authorising and assisting. The second action is in relation to the Caulfield riots. The Caulfield riots happened in November 2023, wherein a large number of people descended on Caulfield following a fire at Burgatory, and violence ensued, and Central Shul was evacuated during Friday night Tefillot, Friday night prayers. And the other actions in relation to, there was a Never Again Is Now rally in May 2024, and a call out was put on social media to gate crash this. Large number of people came across there. There was violence, epithets, and all the rest done there. And they're the three actions that I've got. So I'm just going to play you, if I may, some material to give you a little bit of an understanding of the basis upon which that comes to be. So the first is here. This is in relation to Shane Patton. Shane Patton is the Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police. In October 2023, and I'm saying October 2023, shortly after the 7th of October massacre, and only days after the horrible events that we saw at Opera House, Shane Patton was interviewed by Neil Mitchell, who's a talkback radio host in Melbourne. If you live in Sydney, Neil's now retired, but it's in the equivalent, I guess, of Ben Fordham. Got a very large audience. And this is his interview, which I'm going to play for you.
There was, at that rally, somebody was carrying a photograph of a known and recognised terrorist, the leader of Hezbollah. Is that a crime?
No, it's not a crime, but anything, and I gave clear instructions yesterday, and I'm not sure that all of our members would recognise a picture of that leader, but I gave clear instructions to my staff yesterday, and hopefully it filtered down, I believe it did, that anyone conducting themselves with vitriol, with hatred, inciting violence, that we would take action and that we would intervene through, if it's not a crime, through a breach of a peace and move them on.
Well, thank heavens it didn't happen here, but anybody chanting gas the Jews or kill the Jews, would that be a crime?
it could potentially be a crime under our Religious and Racial Tolerance Act, and so I have given those instructions that we can't allow that type of conduct to occur here in any rally or demonstration, and that we would intervene.
So I guess what's pertinent about that, and we'll come to it shortly, is that this interview happened in October 2023. In it, Shane Patton shows an awareness of certain conduct as problematic and as divisive. He articulates that if it doesn't meet the threshold of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, that they would intervene. You can see that it loads, if it's not a crime, through a breach of the peace and move on. That if it didn't meet the threshold of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, they would utilize other laws at their disposal to disperse that crowd and stop anything that was divisive. But as we know, that's not what transpired. And so therefore the question at law is whether that failure, given their knowledge of that conduct, amounts to authorising assisting, and therefore renders the state of Victoria and Victoria Police liable. There's a lot of minutiae and detail in this case about that knowledge and how that knowledge was conveyed to them and how it was conveyed and their failures. But because those matters are presently being contested, it's not appropriate to ventilate them here. The second one is in relation to the Caulfield riots, which I spoke about before, and I'll just give you the news clip from the day.
Palestinian rally in the heart of Melbourne's Jewish community, forcing this synagogue behind me to be evacuated. Two sides of this global conflict on opposite sides of the street, and it's been widely condemned by politicians of both major parties. In the absence of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong tweeted, "People come to Australia because they want to live in a country that is peaceful, tolerant and respectful. We must all protect that," while opposition leader Peter Dutton said it was a deliberate act of incitement designed to end in violence, and predictably it did. And that's exactly why the state government and Victoria Police are now on high alert.
We cannot allow violence in the Middle East to beget violence here on the streets of Melbourne. We must come together and support one another. We must come together and support people who've lost loved ones, people who are grieving.
Now, all of this happened in the wake of a burgatory store owned by an outspoken pro-Palestinian supporter ablaze there early on Friday. Now, since then, Victoria Police have said that blaze is being treated as suspicious but not as a hate crime.
So that's the Caulfield riot, and the action that I've got there is against the people that I believe are responsible for inciting that. And again, because those matters before the tribunal, it's not appropriate for me to ventilate them more. And the third action is in relation to the Never Again Is Now rally, which was in May. And this was a rally that was organised to stand with the Jewish community against acts of anti-Semitism. And people took to social media the night before, called people to come out and gate crash this rally, and it turned violent. And here's a news clip from the day.
Palestine activists gate-crashed an anti-Semitism rally at State Parliament, sparking chaos. Police battled to keep the opposing groups apart, resulting in several arrests.
Fire, fury.
Sorry.
And two sides face to face in the city. This is what Jewish supporters walked through, police escorting them past a crowd angry in the name of supporting Palestine.
Never again means never again.
They were trying to attend a demonstration outside Parliament organised by Christians supporting Jews. The difference in tone there, startling. Old or young, it mattered little. Every person walking through targeted.
My sister on the floor. They wouldn't let us in. They screamed in our faces about being baby killers.
Never again means never again.
Some firing back. Earlier, a few blocks away, a now regular Sunday appointment. Palestinian supporters filled the State Library forecourt, then the streets marching. Today had all the indicators of a powder keg waiting to explode. Eventually it did. Police ready. March organisers changed the route today to avoid conflict while protesting. That worked until the march finished, when much of that crowd joined the protest on Spring Street. About 100 metres and several hundred officers keeping a no-go zone between the groups.
Where are you taking me?
Maintaining the line, at times, impossible.
Move back to your own safety.
Without the help of the mounted branch.
And I want to see us all come back together and work together, because there's legitimate arguments on all sides here.
Being vocal, saying no to hate is what we need to do.
This was the first Christian-Jewish gathering. Similar events are planned for other capital cities where there are regular pro-Palestine protests. Melbourne setting the scene for potential flare-ups across the country. Blake Johnson, 7 News.
So, in relation to those two particular events, in particular, we take the Caulfield riots, and again, the Never Again Is Now rally. We know, and we saw this right at the outset of my presentation, if you recall, that we saw that incidents that transpired in October of this year and were people arrested and charged for in November this year included serious racial, or in that case, religious vilification, racial vilification and gross offensive public conduct. And there's no reason why Victoria Police could not have, and indeed they should have, charged the individuals responsible for both of those rallies with that conduct. There was also other powers, and if you recall in Shane Patton's interview with Neil Mitchell, he mentioned that if it wasn't a crime, that he could have charged him with other things, such as breach of the peace. So there are other powers at the disposal of Victoria Police, and the real question is why they didn't use them. And I've got to tell you, one of the things that really disturbed me when I was preparing for my research for tonight was I came across the last one there, disturbing a religious place of worship. And it's section 21 of the Summary Offences Act. And as you will recall, we all know that when that crowd converged on Caulfield in November last year, a shul had to be evacuated. A shul in Melbourne, Australia, had to be stopped during tefillot, during prayers on a Friday night, and people sent home. And section 21 of the Act, I'm going to read it to you, says the following: any person who willfully and without lawful justification or excuse, the proof of which lies upon him, disquiets or disturbs any meeting of persons lawfully assembled for religious worship, shall be guilty of an offence. Now, if you break down the legislation very clearly, there's a reverse onus on the individual accused to prove that they weren't responsible, because the words say the proof of which lies upon him. So once the shul was disturbed and they had to evacuate it, the presumption was one of guilt, if you read the legislation. And so my real question is, with such an easy and straightforward prosecutable offence, not even a prosecutable offence, it's a summary offence, available at Victoria Police's disposal, why didn't they use it? Now, I want to tell you where the injustice gets even worse, because the window for charging anyone under that specific element is closed, because subsection 2 states that prosecution for an offence against this section shall be commenced within 3 months after the offence is committed. And I pause there, because if this government was bona fide about protecting the community, if this government was bona fide about protecting religious observance, as a minimum, any individual who was party to the disruption of prayers on a Friday night should have been charged under section 21 of the Summary Offences Act. Full stop. And the fact that they didn't, to me, speaks volumes, particularly because the reverse onus would be on the accused to prove that they weren't guilty. So what are some of the outcomes that I'm looking for here? So in relation to the matters that the State of Victoria Police, and we're almost finished and we're going to go to questions, is I'm looking for a public statement or an affirmation from the Chief Commissioner, the Premier and the Police Minister that the right to protest is not an absolute one. I want them to draw on what the case of Cottrell and Ross said, is that freedom of speech and political debate is not absolute. It does not give you the right to engage in conduct that incites racial or religious hatred. Secondly, I want the Chief of Commissioner of Police, the Premier and the Police Minister to apologise to the Jewish community and the broader community for the failures that have resulted in the normalisation of anti-Semitism and the destruction of social cohesion in the state of Victoria and indeed Australia. I want an internal review by the Chief Commissioner of Police to undertake an investigation to determine why his instruction, which he talks about with Neil Mitchell, that he gave to his members on the day wasn't upheld. And then the last one is I want Victoria Police, and most criminal charges aren't time barred, to review footage of various rallies, protests and the like, to see whether there is a possibility for charges and lay those charges where appropriate. In relation to the actions I have over the Caulfield riots and those who gate crashed the Neighbour Again is Now rally, I'm looking for a finding that the respondents breached the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. I'm looking for a finding that the respondents' breaches of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act caused fear and harm to members of the Jewish community, and in so doing denied them of the basic human right of security and identity. And what do I mean by security and identity? Every person has the right at law to be secure in who they identify as a Jew, as a Christian, as an Aboriginal, as a homosexual. At law, we have an intrinsic right to have security and identity. And by not addressing anti-Semitism and not addressing it, we led to a situation where we have kids in university today who won't wear a yarmulke or hide the mogging of it. And that is not acceptable. I'm then looking for a finding that the respondents' conduct damaged social cohesion in Melbourne, Australia, and in so doing undermined Australia's proud multicultural history and inclusive nature. I'm also looking for a finding that their conduct caused significant public resources to be deployed, and that the respondents be required to compensate the state of Victoria for the cost of that. It shouldn't be the taxpayer's responsibility to pay for the cost incurred as a result of criminal acts, and these people should be held accountable. I just want to finish off with one last thing, and many of you know Elie Wiesel. And anyone who's read Elie Wiesel's works will know that particularly in Night, he talks about when he was in the concentration camps, he always said to himself, if only the world knew, they would do something about it. You know, they would bomb the railway lines, they would do something about it. And then he said he came out and he discovered they knew and they didn't do it. And so in a speech at the Oval Office, he said the following. He said, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And it is on that note I really want to finish, because my father was born in Germany in 1922. He was 51 years old when I was born. And one of the reasons that I stand up strong and proud today is because I feel that that's one way of honoring my father's memory and the legacy of my father, and also of his generations that past and gone. And that each of us in this room tonight, and indeed every member of the community, has an ability to stand up to anti-Semitism. Some of us can do it through taking on legal action, and some of us can do it from writing letters to the editor. Some of us can do it from calling Talkback Radio or writing letters to the MPs. Or we can do it from the smallest little act, by just being decent human beings and make known that we stand with the Jewish community and with Israel, and being upright and generous. And it's through those acts, through that positive acts, we can change the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Menachem. I'll do our 1 minute promotion, but before I do, I think what you're doing is quite synergistic with some things that AJA and AJA Tzedakah does, and maybe tomorrow or the next day I'll have a conversation with you about how we can leverage that synergy a little bit more effectively. But as we do each week, we need people to be active supporters, particularly now. So at the end of the event, if you are not yet connected via the email list or following our social media, go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can sign up to the email list and be notified of what we're doing. Robert in a moment will say something about the major annual fundraiser that we're doing through AJA Tzedakah, which is this Sunday, and it is our vehicle for fighting anti-Semitism. And I'll just foreshadow that we have an extraordinary event coming up next week. AJA has booked Hillel Newer. He very, very rarely does online events. As many of you would know, he's probably the most effective in the world in calling out certain UN agencies, particularly UNRWA and UNIFIL, who have been significant in the conflict. I want to thank Greg Rosshandler for helping organise this, and that's one to spread the news about and not miss. Same time next week. Thank you. Robert.
Thank you. So, yeah, thanks, Menachem. That was an incredible talk and very, very important work you're doing, which is sort of connected to the theme. Very often ask supporters for money, but we have David, AJ Tzedakah annual charity fundraiser. That's where AJ Tzedakah gets almost all its funding for the year ahead. Last year, we raised over $200,000 from well over 500 individual members of the community, and we were able to accomplish some great things, which many of you would have seen. Unfortunately, under Labour governments, anti-Semitism has only gotten much worse. So we have a lot more work cut out for the year ahead. We do have some exciting plans, which we'll be announcing shortly. But as many of you know, AJ Tzedakah receives no grants from the government, no big foundations like other Jewish organizations do. So that does allow us to be independent and to call out anti-Semitism wherever it occurs. But it means we rely on the generosity of thousands of individual members of the community. So everyone, donations are now open. So please, after this talk, go to www.charity.com/AJAT. We'll also put that in the chat. Help us fight for a better Jewish future. It is tax deductible donations, and any amount, no matter how small, helps. Thank you so much. Over to questions.
Thank you. I've just popped that link in the chat if you'd like to click on it after the Zoom. Alan, please unmute.
Thanks to Neil and hi, Menachem. You and our community are justifiably critical of the police, but don't they just take their orders from the Commissioner and he gets his instructions from the police minister, and it's the minister that sits at the government table? So shouldn't the blame be more accurately placed at the feet of the government? And if so, how do we then reconcile that to how the judicial system functions?
I mean, there are many prongs to that question. And Alan, look, I think hopefully at the beginning of my presentation, you were able to see the inconsistency in how the law is applied. What we saw, for those that tuned in a little late, was that in October of this year, there were certain instances where a Chinese flag was burnt and various people that were pro-refugees were targeted by neo-Nazis. And within 2 weeks of those events, the individuals responsible were charged under the racial, or proposed to be charged under the Racial Religious Tolerance Act and with grossly offensive conduct. Yet, when similar things happened with the burning of the Israeli flag, they weren't charged. And if we actually pull apart Alan's question, his question is, does the blame for that fall at the feet of the police or the feet of the government? And I think there's a truth to what Alan says, because if you listen to the interview which I played with you between Neil Mitchell and Shane Patton articulated that he thought certain conduct was problematic. He said that even if it didn't meet the criminal threshold, he'd given an instruction for people to be moved on with breach of the peace laws, where they conduct themselves with vitriol and hate. Yet that's not what transpired. So the question really is whether there is some tension, and we won't know this maybe perhaps until the case runs all the way, but whether there's some tension between the police minister and the chief commissioner, or between the government and the police over these laws. Because I've got to tell you, with some of the police officers that I interact with, I can tell you they are chomping at the bit to do something. They feel incredibly frustrated. I've had officers privately say to me that they feel as if they've been hamstrung and prevented. So there it does appear to be a political dynamic, and I can't help but wonder that if we had a government of different colour, that perhaps not a government that is socially left aligned, and a government, and for those that know, the social left is anti-Israel. That's where Bob Carr comes from and the like. That perhaps we would see a very different approach to law enforcement. And so there is a fairness to that. In relation to the judiciary, well, that's a little bit more of a difficult one because we have the separation of powers doctrine, which stipulates that there's a separation of powers, or should be, between the government, the police, and the judiciary, and therefore each should stand on their own foot. But also we know there's a bit of controversy in the US at the moment because the Supreme Court, which is equivalent to our High Court, there's going to be some vacancies coming up. And there's a concern, particularly from people that are of the left, that Donald Trump will utilize his period of time in power to stack the Supreme Court with people which have similar political views to him. So when it comes time to interpret the legislation, they will interpret it in a way that's consistent with his ideology. So I guess politics finds its way the way through. I'd like to think that the law is the law, but we also know that people unfortunately are coloured. Hopefully, Alan, I've answered your question.
Thank you. Jeff, please unmute.
Shalom Menachem. I find it interesting and that the so-called leading Jewish organizations like the ECAJ, ZFA, AJAC, and JCCV, even Orges up to a point, they do not seem to help you in any way whatsoever. All this falls on your broad shoulders. I find that frustrating. I think the other organizations, a lot of them are off the left as well. They're so ensconced, I think is a good word, ensconced in the two-state solution. They are completely moribund in the real dangers Jews face in just walking down the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and anywhere else. Are you, in fact, getting any help from any of these so-called large organizations who still regard themselves as leaders of the Jewish community in spite of AJA's latest foray into getting a name for themselves?
Jeff, contrary to others' belief, I think the Jewish community today is more united post 7th of October than it was pre-7th of October. I think, unfortunately, we've come to realize that we have a common enemy, and that enemy is not within, but it's external to us. We saw that prior to 7th of October in Israel, the society was fractured. There were large protests against the governments on the street. Come 7th of October, things have changed. Views have changed. And the same, I think, is true in Australia as well. I know from my own experience, and I guess I've got to be careful what I say, that I am getting support from those organizations that you mentioned. Each of them have a different way of providing support. Some of them have assisted legally, including in drafting or sending letters on my behalf or communications on my behalf. So I don't think it's fair to say that this all falls on my shoulders. I think sometimes it's easier for an individual who may not have some of the external pressures that some other organizations have to run a case. So I'm not tied to any political organization or any particular employer. So there's very little comeback or very little leverage that people can apply to me in form of a detriment. So the case will stand on its own merit. Whereas if an organization that might be subject to government funding runs a case of this nature, that could be problematic, particularly if they make various statements or push the rest of it, or an individual in a private capacity runs an action, but they're working for a large corporate, that also could come unstuck. So I think what I'm trying to say to you is, yes, I'm getting a lot of support. Some of that is behind the scenes, and there'll be a range of reasons why some of that's done privately.
Thank you, Menachem. And Anne, please unmute.
Hi, Menachem. Great to see you again. So I have two questions. First one is regards to the Purgatory hoax. Do you think you could launch a lawsuit against the owner of the Purgatory, Haitian Taya, don't know his name, for spreading this hoax and vilifying the Jewish community for this? And number two, when I met you at the Israel Bethel Ethics, I think there was a talk about the underlying ideology that Hamas uses. How do we criticize the ideology without targeting the Muslim community?
I want to be careful what I say about any specific individual, because I don't want to stray into a situation I might say something that's defamatory. So I'm going to, if it's okay, pass on that first question rather than say anything that could be misconstrued in any way. In relation to ideology, look, I'm probably not well schooled in that area to be able to answer that. But I think one of the problems that we really face, and I think we've seen this as well, is that there's some crossover. We talk about at the beginning, I talked about at the beginning of my speech, that Jews are facing two wars at the present point in time. We're facing a physical war where our enemy is trying to annihilate us. So we're facing a war for our survival. And the second war we're facing is a war of narratives where language is being used to dehumanize the Jewish population, to enable it to prosecute the physical war. And that's where Hamas and the Hamas ideology coming out of Iran comes together. So what we're seeing on the streets is some of these, I'm going to use the word useful idiots, utilizing some of this dehumanizing language, which is in essence part of the Hamas or Iran ideology, which enables them to prosecute the war against Jews and say the war is a just war by, for example, using the term Jews are committing genocide. And anyone who knows the legal definition of genocide knows that we aren't even close to the legal threshold question. Well, in my opinion anyway. Anyone who's followed the ruling of the court will know that they actually did not find that there was genocide. So the reason I say that out loud, one of the big issues that we have is the contamination of the Hamas desire to wipe out the Jewish people with certain language through useful idiots that are now enabling this war to transpire. And I think that's really one of the large problems we have, and that we need to push back again. And again, refer back to the timeline. 1933 was when the boycotts were. 1941 when Auschwitz was established. So it's like that analogy of the frog in the hot water, you know, that gets comfortable, they turn up the temperature, and then boils. And we don't know how we got there. And we have to push back before that language becomes normalized and accepted. We aren't terrorists. We are people who believe in the right to self-determination in our historical homeland, a land to which we have a connection for over 3,000 years. And we don't need to apologize for that.
Thank you, Menachem. We are getting close to time, so the final question we'd like to ask you is what can we and our members do to support you and what you're doing? And what is your final message to us for this evening, please?
At this point in time, I'm okay. I think, you know, sometimes a pat on the shoulder is not a bad thing. We all need a bit of a pat on the shoulder. But at this point in time, more than that, I'm not asking anything from anybody. I think there are some great organizations out there, and I think each of these organizations play a role, and I think that we should support our organizations. I think also Am Yisrael, you know, B'lev Echad, you know, Am Echad, B'lev Echad, one nation, one heart is very important this time, and that we should be looking to unite together to find our commonality, not our points of difference. And I think that's one of the best ways we can fight anti-Semitism and the issues that we face if we unite as a community. And as I said during my speech, if we conduct ourselves with like mentioned, like decent individuals, conduct ourselves with respectability towards our fellow man, regardless of their observance. And so therefore, through that, we can show, and as we know from the Holocaust, the righteous Gentiles that stood up for the non-Jewish population often had a positive experience with the Jewish population prior to the Holocaust. So if we can make sure that we have positive experience with everyone in the world, hopefully that will encourage others to stand up with us. So therefore, we as a small part of the overall population aren't alone. And I see in the audience tonight, there are members of the non-Jewish community, and I just want to call out to them and say, thank you very much. Your support doesn't go unnoticed and isn't unappreciated, is warmly appreciated and warmly embraced. So thank you, and thank you very much from the bottom of our heart.
Menachem, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for everything you are doing. It is inspiring for us to know that there are people standing up for our community, that are taking action, and that are winning against the fight against anti-Semitism, the fight against bigotry, and to have people like you representing us and doing the right thing is inspiring. I'll remind everyone for the final time for tonight, our charity campaign is on Sunday. Please just send the link to one person, 2 people, family, friends. This is the last Wednesday night. We will badger you with this, but please support us so that we can continue to fight anti-Semitism for another year and continue to call out hatred when we need to. And it is your support that gets us there. Thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. This has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow and on our Facebook page. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Menachem, and good evening.
Thank you.